tube is the most awesome goddamn force in the whole godless world.
I'm literally just trying to watch Luka Doncic highlights.
You're beginning to believe the illusions we're spinning here. You're beginning to think that the tube is reality and that your own lives are unreal.
I'll tell you this much, my life is going to be very unreal if Luka doesn't find a way to get past the Warriors.
You do whatever the tube tells you. You dress like the tube, you eat like the tube, you raise your children like the tube, you even think like the tube.
You say that like it's a bad thing.
This is mass madness, you maniacs. In God's name, you people are the real thing. We are the illusion.
We get it, Billiam. You can do the policeman in all different voices.
I can't remember which American writer it was. I heard him speak and he said that his job is to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable.
Yeah. Hello, and welcome to Books You Haven't Read. My name is Nate Rankin. Today's episode we're talking about Homo Zapiens by Victor Pelevin. So I have owned a copy of this book for nearly 10 years now. And I remember picking it up because I heard Pelevin was like a Russian Douglas Coupland or Bret Easton Ellis. And I had previously read Amun-Ra, his short novella. It's about a Soviet cosmonaut, as well as The Yellow Arrow, which is an even much shorter novella. And I really, really like Borderline Love. Amun-Ra, and The Yellow Arrow was solid. One of the things that's always sort of first mentioned when talking about Pelevin is that he's Buddhist, because a lot of Buddhist themes and motifs come up in his work. Though to be fair, in Homo Zapiens, there's at least as much stuff about like ancient Babylonian religions. In this one, particularly the goddess Ishtar. This book is known by 3 titles, and that's where I want to start. The original Russian is Generation P. The P is whatever the Cyrillic equivalent of P is. And Generation P the P in that could stand for a couple different things. The opening chapter talks about, I don't know if it's Generation P or Generation Pepsi, but it talks about, so in the late 70s, the first chapter is called Generation P. So Pepsi was introduced to the Soviets in the 1970s, and that kind of became the default Soviet soda. Pepsi kind of becomes a useful shibboleth for consumer capitalism's first step into Russia, and our main character, Babylon Tatarsky, becomes an ad copywriter in post-Soviet Russia. So the first thing this title is doing is recalling a previous generation's moniker and then sort of redeploying it for its own purposes. So what could the new P mean? There are a couple things. One, you could claim that it's Generation Perestroika. Perestroika is in Glasnost, where the two kind of main words or themes for Gorbachev, who was the last Soviet leader during his premiership. And perestroika means reconstruction or reform, and glasnost means like transparency or openness. These are two things that Gorbachev really wanted to stress. And so that took place in the 80s and into the early 90s until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Some other things that it could be, Generation Putin, because in many ways it doesn't anticipate Putin himself, who even as late as 1998 was pretty much an unknown commodity in Russia. 1998 was when this was published. But there are a lot of things that it kind of anticipates. It anticipates a certain milieu about Russia in the coming years. And then there's Generation Pelevin, perhaps, sort of maybe trying to be cheeky with his own last name and stake his claim as being the, voice of a generation or something. More like voice crack of a generation. I'm 31 going on, I'll get out of puberty one day. But sort of the consensus, and this may actually be what the author says the P is supposed to stand for, is that the P stands for pizdets. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. Because apparently it's a vulgar word for female genitalia. I think it's like the word cunt for us, but it's used to say essentially we're screwed. So it translates to generation screwed. The title of the British edition, which is the one that I have, is Homo Zapiens, and I'll talk more about that sort of later in the video. But just very briefly, Homo Zapiens is like a new name for the species of kind of TV watching humans that the protagonist comes up with. As for the American version is called Babylon. And that invokes, a couple different things. First off, the character's name is Babylon Tatarsky. And it was apparently a very trendy thing for like Soviet parents to make amalgamations or acronyms, I guess, of old Soviet heroes for their children. And so in English, it's Babylon. In Russia, it's Vavilon. Replace the B's with V's. So the explanation is a little different. In the American version, it comes from, the L-E-N stands for Lenin. The baby, or Babi, stands for Babi Yar, which is the name of a Lyudvichenko poem from the early 60s that is mourning that there is no memorial for the Holocaust sites. There were like 30,000 people shot over a day-and-a-half period, I believe, and it was the single largest, I think, kind of extermination in the Holocaust. And as late as the 70s, there was no memorial for them, and this was in Kyiv, Ukraine. Eventually, the Soviets did build a memorial, and in 2022, in the ongoing war in Ukraine, the Russian Federation shot a bunch of missiles at it and killed 5 people. I believe most of the building or the memorial is still standing. In the Russian edition, it's a different writer. It's a guy named Vasily Askionov, and then, so that's the VA, because it's Vavilon, and then VI Lenin, so VI Lenin. Babylon obviously invokes the name of the ancient city. As I said, there's some Babylonian religious stuff being played a lot with here. But the other thing is that if you know anything about like the eschatology of Christianity, the name of Babylon is synonymous with the end times. His last name, Tatarsky, that's kind of an obvious reference to the Tatars, who are the indigenous people to the Crimean Peninsula. And the Tatars were famously like mass deported from the Crimean Peninsula in the days of Stalin during one of his purges, because he got paranoid that they were, plotting against him. And so they sent them throughout all corners and dispersed that the entire population across Russia. And the reason that that's significant is because it invokes this kind of, stranger in your own homeland. And that's kind of what this book is about. It is about waking up in a place that has, always been the bulwark against consumerist capitalism, and it is now a place that has been colonized by consumerist capitalism. All right, I've babbled on enough. Terrible. Let's talk about the plot. Tatarsky at first goes to like a technical institute for electric stoves or something tediously stupid. But he has sort of a conversion experience to literature and writing, and he ends up professionally at first translating Uzbek and Kyrgyz poetry. Then the USSR collapses, and the way that Pelevin writes about it is particularly funny, and I'll read that now. Then, quite unobtrusively, an event of fundamental significance for his future occurred. The USSR, which they'd begun to renovate and improve at about the time when Tatarsky decided to change his profession, improved so much that it ceased to exist. If a state is capable of entering nirvana, that's what must have happened in this case. So that really captures, I think, a cheeky humor infused with obvious Buddhist motifs, and sums up the absurdity and rapidity with which the USSR collapsed. And he gets a part-time job working at a kiosk until one day an old friend discovers him, and he eventually gets into advertising copywriting. And the novel is about his, I hesitate to say ascendancy. Yes, career-wise, he is ascendant, but it's also kind of a descent into hell, or a descent or progression through, let's call it, a hyper-real and hallucinatory Russia that he discovers is increasingly ruled and produced by admin in media entities. And so it becomes this like slow burning horror of deeper and deeper layers that he discovers. The book was published in 1998, and that was when Russia went through a huge financial crisis. And so that is another one of the sort of background components that figures into this story. One of the really astoundingly clever things is the inclusion of a lot of different advertising treatments that, you know, Tatarsky puts together. For instance, he has a treatment for Sprite really early on, you know, so he takes the concept of Sprite as the uncola, and this was one of the ways it was originally marketed, right? And starts off by saying Russia is for sure headed to a military dictatorship. And since Coca-Cola is known as the taste of freedom associated with America, Sprite ought to play into that dynamic and embrace a nationalistic aesthetic, a more authoritarian aesthetic, you know, as sort of being this Russian or Slav soda. And therefore it will have a natural spot as like a counterbalance in the market. And then, of course, he comes to realize that, hey, it's not Sprite, it's 7-Up that you're thinking of that was marketed as the uncola. Little funny after he writes out this whole treatment. But there's a really great bleak, cynical treatment that's done in a deliberately thought out process. And I thought the way Pelevin put it in this passage really captured it succinctly. Tatarsky realized what the difference was between the era of decaying imperialism and the era of primitive capital accumulation. In the West, both the client who ordered advertising and the copywriter tried to brainwash the consumer. But in Russia, the copywriter's job was to screw with the client's brains. Tatarsky realized in addition that Morkovin was right, and this situation was never going to change. One day, after smoking some especially good grass, he uncovered by pure chance the basic economic law of post-socialist society. Initial accumulation of capital is also final. So let's talk about the title of my edition now. Homo Zapiens comes from chapter 7, and as I mentioned, it's sort of this, you know, neologism of species that Tatarsky comes up with. The inside flap promises a Che Guevara Ouija board scene, and this is the chapter that delivers on that. Essentially, Tatarsky, while especially inebriated, summons the spirit of Che Guevara, who is acting like a prophet of Buddha, mixed with, like, you know, your basic state college philosophy professor.
Break and reform and circle around one another, and kind of pull on each other magnetically until it coheres in something like a whole shape, you know?
I won't go through all the mechanics of it because it's kind of just a little convoluted, and the mechanics are such that it's just a little too hard to explain in easy summary, which, by the way, is something I think is quite brilliant, because I think that little leitmotif of whatever you want to call it, of being too hard to explain, is something that's like essentially Russian. So I really appreciated it. But essentially, the philosophical problem or crisis that humanity is at in Tatarsky's mind, or in, you know, Guevara channeled through Tatarsky's mind, the ego, which is already illusory, okay, is kind of stuck in like a regressive Drost effect of ever more virtual viewers. The TV viewer's ego is hijacked and replaced by the ego of the TV, because the TV is the one directing the brain's attention, okay? And that ego is produced by a collection of, you know, screenwriters, TV producers, and advertising copywriters. So that ego displaces the true ego, and Guevara / Tatarsky calls this Homo Zapiens. Here's another good quote of kind of succinctly summing up what he's trying to talk about. HZ is simply the residual luminescence of a soul fallen asleep. It is a film about the shooting of another film shown on a television in an empty house. And that, again, is another one of the sort of main leitmotifs of this book, is that the Russian experience all seems to be built on one unreality after another. Everything is understood to be a house of cards, or I think he describes it as a castle built on air whose foundation is an abyss. There's this, you know, regressive layering of cynicism toward reality, and toward, I would say, toward the authority of reality as well. there's an underlying theme of reality being a rug that can be pulled out from under you, like the Soviet Union was kind of pulled out from under all these different people. Everything is understood to be a house of cards. Everyone takes an extremely cynical view of everything, and a lot of this cynicism is understood to be baked into the economy that ends up failing. It's a little more complicated than that in real life, but it's effective. I'm not going to get into anything spoilery with this, but I do highly recommend this book. As someone who has read all of Douglas Coupland and Bret Easton Ellis, I do have to say I think Pelevin is better and more imaginative. However, that may have a lot to do with my particular interests in fascination with Russia, especially the Soviet Union. Which is to say, it's easier for me to be fascinated by the cultural prognostications of a foreign country as opposed to my own, because I've read so many cultural prognostications of my own. So newer may just be more interesting. The writer that Pelevin actually most reminds me of is not Coupland or Easton Ellis, but Flann O'Brien, the Irish author. Each of these guys has a skill, I think, in infusing and sometimes outright bastardizing various philosophical concepts into stories that take place in funhouse versions of their own countries, and they explore kind of, respectively, Irish and Russian identity. Both are really funny, and both make me extremely jealous of their imaginations. I love this book, highly recommend. I think it's particularly interesting to read given the war in Ukraine. I think it helps contextualize a lot of the sort of national psyche and experience of where Russia is at these days. So, thank you for watching. Let me know if you guys have read any other Pelevin, or if you have any other contemporary kind of Russian authors to recommend. I've read Vladimir Sorokin, I believe is how you pronounce it. I read Day of the Oprichnik. Wasn't that impressed by it, but I know he's like the other big name. He's the other big name that I know in contemporary Russian. Hope your day is going well, and...
Talking about the inherent weirdness of viewing, I guess, like the horrors of real life through the trivializing structures of the internet.
Look at Facebook, like your fun magician content where they don't do something for 5 minutes and then eventually do it and it's disappointing. That is going to have the same functional form as a news report from Ukraine, or a story about universal credit in the north of England, or a story about the opioid crisis in the United States. And all of these things ultimately have the same form, so it's all crushed into these boxes. And those are those two structures that join together and create this concept of structural dissonance, which is where the structures of the internet, both the informal structures of how everything links together and the formal structures of how you look at something in a specific way, conflict with content, which creates this extremely uneasy feeling, which I think dissonance is the best way to describe it. The things clash in a way that you can't quite describe, and you couldn't pick the two out of each other, but at the same time, they make each other very uncomfortable